Mr. Gowan, though at the same time the very same people would not have dreamed of taking him for themselves or their daughters. Then he goes into the country, besides, to think about making sketches, and in all places where there are visitors, he has a large acquaintance and is very well known. Besides all this, he has a friend who is much in his society both at home and away from home, though he treats this friend very coolly and is very uncertain in his behaviour to him. I am quite sure, because she has told me so, that she does not like this friend. He is so revolting to me, too, that his being away from here at present is quite a relief to my mind. How much more to hers? But what I particularly want you to know, and why I have resolved to tell you so much while I am afraid it may make you a little uncomfortable without occasion, is this. She is so true and so devoted, and knows so completely that all her love and duty are his forever, that you may be certain she will love him, admire him, praise him, and conceal all his faults until she dies. I believe she conceals them, and always will conceal them, even from herself. She has given him her heart. That can never be taken back, and however much he may try it, he will never wear out its affection. You know the truth of this, as you know everything, far, far better than I, but I cannot help telling you what a nature she knows, and that you can never think too well of her. I have not yet called her by name in this letter, but we are such friends now that I do so when we are quietly together, and she speaks to me by my name. I mean, not my Christian name, but the name you gave me. When she began to call me Amy, I told her my short story, and that you had always called me Little Dorrit. I had told her that the name was much dearer to me than any other, and so she calls me Little Dorrit too. Perhaps you have not heard from her father or mother yet, and may not know that she has a baby son. He was born only 2 days ago, and just a week after they came. It has made them very happy. However, I must tell you, as I am to tell you all, that I fancy they are under a constraint with Mr. Gowan, and that they feel as if his mocking way with them was sometimes a slight given to their love for her. It was but yesterday, when I was there, that I saw Mr. Meagles change colour and get up and go out, as if he was afraid that he might say so, unless he prevented himself by that means. Yet I am sure they are both so considerate, good-humoured, and reasonable, that he might spare them. It is hard in him not to think of them a little more. I stopped at the last full stop to read all this over. It looked at first as if I was taking on myself to understand and explain so much that I was half inclined not to send it. But when I thought it over a little, I felt more hopeful for your knowing at once that I had only been watchful for you, and had only noticed what I think I have noticed, because I was quickened by your interest in it. Indeed, you may be sure that it is the truth. And now I have done with the subject in the present letter, and have little left to say. We are all quite well, and Fanny improves every day. You can hardly think how kind she is to me, and what pains she takes with me. She has a lover who has followed her first all the way from Switzerland, and then all the way from Venice, and it was just confided to me that he means to follow her everywhere. I was much confused by his speaking to me about it, but he would. I did not know what to say, but at last I told him that I thought he had better not. For Fanny, but I did not tell him this, is much too spirited and clever to suit him. Still, he said he would, all the same. I have no lover, of course. If you should ever get so far as this in this long letter, you will perhaps say, surely Little Dorrit will not leave off without telling me something about her travels, and surely it is time she did. I think it is indeed, but I don't know what to tell you. Since we left Venice, we have been in a great many wonderful places, Genoa and Florence among them, and have seen so many wonderful sights that I am almost giddy when I think what a crowd they make. But you can tell me so much more about them than I can tell you, that why I should tire you with my accounts and descriptions. Dear Mr. Clennam, as I had the courage to tell you what the familiar difficulties in my travelling mind were before, I will not be a coward now. One of my frequent thoughts is this. Old as these cities are, their age itself is hardly so curious to my reflections, as that they should have been in their places all through those days when I did not even know of their existence of more than 2 or 3 of them, and when I scarcely knew of anything outside our walls. There is something melancholy in it, and I don't know why. When we went to see the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, it was a bright, sunny day, and it and the buildings near it looked so old, and the earth and the sky looked so young, and its shadows on the ground were so soft and retired. I could not at first think how beautiful it was or how curious, but I thought, oh, how many times when the shadow of the wall was fallen on our room, and when that weary tread of feet was going up and down the yard, oh, how many times this place was just as quiet and lovely as it is today. It quite overpowered me. My heart was so full that tears burst out of my eyes, though I did what I could to restrain them. And I have the same feeling often, often. Do you know that since the change in our fortunes, though I appear to myself to have dreamed more than before, I have always dreamed of myself as very young indeed. I am not very old, you may say. No, but that is not what I mean. I have always dreamed of myself as a child learning to do needlework. I have often dreamed of myself as back there, seeing faces in the yard little known, and which I should have thought I had quite forgotten. But, as often as not, I have been abroad here, in Switzerland or France or Italy, somewhere where we have been, yet always as that little child. I have dreamed of going down to Mrs. General, with the patches on my clothes in which I can first remember myself. I have, over and over again, dreamed of taking my place at dinner at Venice when we have had a large company, in the mourning for my poor mother, which I wore when I was 8 years old, and wore long after it was threadbare and would mend no more. It has been a great distress to me to think how irreconcilable the company would consider it with my father's wealth, and how I should displease and disgrace him and Fanny and Edward by so plainly disclosing what they wished to keep secret. But I have not grown out of the little child in thinking of it, and at the self-same moment I have dreamed that I have sat with the heartache at table, calculating the expenses of the dinner, and quite distracting myself with thinking how they were ever to be made good. I have never dreamed of the change in our fortunes itself. I have never dreamed of your coming back with me that memorable morning to break it. I have never even dreamed of you. Dear Mr. Clennam, it is possible that I have thought of you and others so much by day that I have no thoughts left to wander round you by night. For I must now confess to you that I suffer from homesickness, that I long so ardently and earnestly for home as sometimes when no one sees me to pine for it. I cannot bear to turn my face further away from it. My heart is a little lightened when we turn towards it, even for a few miles, and with the knowledge that we are soon to turn away again. So dearly do I love the scene of my poverty and your kindness. Oh, so dearly. Oh, so dearly. Heaven knows when your poor child will see England again. We are all fond of the life here except me, and there are no plans for our return. My dear father talks of a visit to London late in this next spring on some affairs connected with the property, but I have no hope that he will bring me with him. I have tried to get on a little better under Mrs. General's instruction, and I hope I am not quite so dull as I used to be. I have begun to speak and understand almost easily the hard languages I told you about. I do not remember at the moment when I wrote last that you knew them both, but I remembered it afterwards, and it helped me on. God bless you, dear Mr. Clennam. Do not forget your ever grateful and affectionate little Dorrit. P.S. Particularly remember that Minnie Gowan deserves the best remembrance in which you can hold her. You cannot think too generously or too highly of her. I forgot Mr. Panks last time. Please, if you should see him, give him your little Dorrit's kind regard. He was very good to little Dee. Chapter 12, in which a great patriotic conference is holden. The famous name of Merdle became every day more famous in the land. Nobody knew that the Merdle of such high renown had ever done any good to anyone, alive or dead, or to any earthly thing. Nobody knew that he had any capacity or utterance of any sort in him which had ever thrown for any creature the feeblest farthing candle ray of light on any path of duty or diversion, pain or pleasure, toil or rest, fact or fancy, among the multiplicity of paths in the labyrinth trodden by the sons of Adam. Nobody had the smallest reason for supposing the clay of which this object of worship was made to be other than the commonest clay, with as clogged a wick smouldering inside of it as ever kept an image of humanity from tumbling to pieces. All people knew or thought they knew that he had made himself immensely rich, and, for that reason alone, prostrated themselves before him more degradedly and less excusably than the darkest savage creeps out of his hole in the ground to propitiate, in some log or reptile, the deity of his benighted soul. Nay, the high priests of this worship had the man before them as a protest against their meanness. The multitude worshipped on trust, though always distinctly knowing why, but the officiators at the altar had the man habitually in their view. They sat at his feasts, and he sat at theirs. There was a spectre always attendant on him, saying to these high priests, "Are such the signs you trust and love to honour, this head, these eyes, this mode of speech, the tone and manner of this man? You are the levers of the circumlocution office, and the rulers of men. When half a dozen of you fall out by the ears, it seems that Mother Earth can give birth to no other rulers. Does your qualification lie in the superior knowledge of men which accepts, courts, and puffs this name? Or, if you are competent to judge aright the signs I never fail to show you when he appears among you, is your superior honesty your qualification?" Two rather ugly questions these, always going about town with Mr. Merdle, and there was a tacit agreement that they must be stifled. In Mrs. Merdle's absence abroad, Mr. Merdle still kept the great house open for the passage through it of a stream of visitors. A few of these took affable possession of the establishment. 3 or 4 ladies of distinction and liveliness used to say to one another, "Let us dine at our dear Merdle's next Thursday. Whom shall we have?" Our dear Merdle would then receive his instructions, and would sit heavily among the company at table, and wander lumpishly about his drawing-rooms, afterwards only remarkable for appearing to have nothing to do with the entertainment beyond being in its way. The chief butler, the avenging spirit of this great man's life, relaxed nothing of his severity. He looked on at these dinners when the bosom was not there, as he looked on at other dinners when the bosom was there, and his eye was a basilisk to Mr. Merdle. He was a hard man, and would never bate an ounce of plate or a bottle of wine. He would not allow a dinner to be given unless it was up to his mark. He set forth the table for his own dignity. If the guests chose to partake of what was served, he saw no objection, but it was served for the maintenance of his rank. As he stood by the sideboard, he seemed to announce, "I have accepted office to look at this which is now before me, and to look at nothing less than this." If he missed the presiding bosom, it was as a part of his own state of which he was, from unavoidable circumstances, temporarily deprived. Just as he might have missed a centrepiece or a choice wine cooler which had been sent to the bankers. Mr. Merdle issued invitations for a Barnacle dinner. Lord Decimus was to be there. Mr. Tite Barnacle was to be there. The pleasant young Barnacle was to be there, and the chorus of parliamentary Barnacles who went about the provinces when the house was up, warbling the praises of their chief, were to be represented there. It was understood to be a great occasion. Mr. Merdle was going to take up the Barnacles. Some delicate little negotiations had occurred between him and the noble Decimus, the young Barnacle of engaging manners acting as negotiator, and Mr. Merdle had decided to cast the weight of his great probity and great riches into the Barnacle scale. Jobbery was suspected by the malicious, perhaps because it was indisputable that if the adherents of the immortal enemy of mankind could have been secured by a job, the Barnacles would have jobbed him, for the good of the country, for the good of the country. Mrs. Merdle had written to this magnificent spouse of hers, whom it was heresy to regard as anything less than all the British merchants since the days of Whittington rolled into one and gilded 3 feet deep all over, had written to this spouse of hers several letters from Rome in quick succession, urging upon him with importunity that now or never was the time to provide for Edmund Sparkler. Mrs. Merdle had shown him that the case of Edmund was urgent, and that infinite advantages might result from his having some good thing directly. In the grammar of Mrs. Merdle's verbs on this momentous subject, there was only one mood, the imperative, and that mood had only one tense, the present. Mrs. Merdle's verbs were so pressingly presented to Mr. Merdle to conjugate that his sluggish blood and his long coat cuffs became quite agitated. In which state of agitation Mr. Merdle, evasively rolling his eyes round the chief butler's shoes without raising them to the index of that stupendous creature's thoughts, had signified to him his intention of giving a special dinner, not a very large dinner, but a very special dinner. The chief butler had signified, in return, that he had no objection to look on at the most expensive thing in that way that could be done, and the day of the dinner was now come. Mr. Merdle stood in one of his drawing-rooms, with his back to the fire, waiting for the arrival of his important guests. He seldom or never took the liberty of standing with his back to the fire unless he was quite alone. In the presence of the chief butler, he could not have done such a deed. He would have clasped himself by the wrists in that constabulary manner of his, and have paced up and down the hearthrug, or gone creeping about among the rich objects of furniture, if his oppressive retainer had appeared in the room at that very moment. The sly shadows which seemed to dart out of hiding when the fire rose, and to dart back into it when the fire fell, were sufficient witnesses of his making himself so easy. They were even more than sufficient if his uncomfortable glances at them might be taken to mean anything. Mr. Merdle's right hand was filled with the evening paper, and the evening paper was full of Mr. Merdle. His wonderful enterprise, his wonderful wealth, his wonderful bank were the fattening food of the evening paper that night. The wonderful bank, of which he was the chief projector, establisher, and manager, was the latest of the many Merdle wonders. So modest was Mr. Merdle withal, in the midst of these splendid achievements, that he looked far more like a man in possession of his house under a distraint than a commercial colossus bestriding his own hearthrug, while the little ships were sailing into dinner. Behold the vessels coming into port. The engaging young Barnacle was the first arrival, but Bar overtook him on the staircase. Bar, strengthened as usual with his double eyeglass and his little jury droop, was overjoyed to see the engaging young Barnacle, and opined that we were going to sit in banco, as we lawyers call it, to take a special argument. Indeed, said the sprightly young Barnacle, whose name was Ferdinand. How so? Nay, smiled Bar, if you don't know, how can I know? You are in the innermost sanctuary of the temple. I am one of the admiring concourse on the plain without. Bar could be light in hand or heavy in hand, according to the customer he had to deal with. With Ferdinand Barnacle he was gossamer. Bar was likewise always modest and self-deprecatory in his way. Bar was a man of great variety, but one leading thread ran through the woof of all his patterns. Every man with whom he had to do was in his eyes a juryman, and he must get that juryman over if he could. Our illustrious host and friend, said Bar, our shining mercantile star, going into politics? Going? He has been in Parliament some time, you know, returned the engaging young Barnacle. True, said Bar, with his light comedy laugh for special jurymen, which was a very different thing from his low comedy laugh for comic tradesmen on common juries. He has been in Parliament for some time, yet hitherto our star has been a vacillating and wavering star. An average witness would have been seduced by the into an affirmative answer, but Ferdinand Barnacle looked knowingly at Bar as he strolled upstairs and gave him no answer at all. Just so, said Bar, nodding his head, for he was not to be put off in that way, and therefore I spoke of our sitting in banco to take a special argument, meaning this to be a high and solemn occasion, when, as Captain Macheath says, the judges are met, a terrible show. We lawyers are sufficiently liberal, you see, to quote the captain, though the captain is severe upon us. Nevertheless, I think I could put in evidence an admission to the captain's, said Barr, with a little jocose roll of his head, for in his legal current of speech he always assumed the air of rallying himself with the best grace in the world, an admission of the captain's that law in the gross is at least intended to be impartial. For what says the captain if I quote him correctly, and if not, with a light comedy touch of his double-eyed glass on his companion's shoulder, my learned friend will set me right. Since laws were made for every degree, to curb vice in others as well as in me, I wonder we hadn't better company upon Tyburn Tree. These words brought them to the drawing-room, where Mr. Merdle stood before the fire. So immensely astounded was Mr. Merdle by the entrance of Barr with such a reference in his mouth, that Barr explained himself to have been quoting Gay. "Assuredly not one of our Westminster Hall authorities," said he, "but still no despicable one to a man possessing the largely practical Mr. Merdle's knowledge of the world." Mr. Merdle looked as if he thought he would say something, but subsequently looked as if he thought he wouldn't. The interval afforded time for Bishop to be announced. Bishop came in with meekness, and yet with a strong and rapid step, as if he wanted to get his 7-league dress shoes on and go round the world to see that everybody was in a satisfactory state. Bishop had no idea that there was anything significant in the occasion. That was the most remarkable trait in his demeanour. He was crisp, fresh, cheerful, affable, bland, but so surprisingly innocent. Barr sidled up to prefer his politest inquiries in reference to the health of Mrs. Bishop. Mrs. Bishop had been a little unfortunate in the article of taking cold at a confirmation, but otherwise was well. Young Mr. Bishop was also well. He was down with his young wife and little family at his cure of souls. The representatives of the Barnacle chorus dropped in next, and Mr. Merdle's physician dropped in next. Barr, who had a bit of one eye and a bit of his double eyeglass for everyone who came in at the door, no matter with whom he was conversing or what he was talking about, got among them all by some skilful means, without being seen to get at them, and touched each individual gentleman of the jury on his own individual favourite spot. With some of the chorus, he laughed about the sleepy member who had gone out into the lobby the other night and voted the wrong way. With others, he deplored that innovating spirit in the time which could not even be prevented from taking an unnatural interest in the public service and the public money. With the physician, he had a word to say about the general health. He had also a little information to ask him for concerning a professional man of unquestioned erudition and polished manners, but those credentials in their highest development he believed were the possession of other professors of the healing art, jury droop, whom he had happened to have in the witness box the day before yesterday, and from whom he had elicited in cross-examination that he claimed to be one of the exponents of this new mode of treatment, which appeared to Barr Barr thought so, Barr had thought and hoped. Physician would tell him so. Without presuming to decide where doctors disagreed, it did appear to Barr, viewing it as a question of common sense and not of so-called legal penetration, that this new system might be, in the presence of so great an authority, say, humbug? Ah! Fortified by such encouragement, he could venture to say humbug, and now Barr's mind was relieved. Mr. Tite Barnacle, who, like Dr. Johnson's celebrated acquaintance, had only one idea in his head, and that was a wrong one, had appeared by this time. This eminent gentleman and Mr. Merdle, seated divers ways, with ruminating aspects on a yellow ottoman in the light of the fire, holding no verbal communication with each other, bore a strong general resemblance to the two cows in the Cuyp picture over against them. But now Lord Decimus arrived. The chief butler, who up to this time had limited himself to a branch of his usual function by looking at the company as they entered, and that, with more of defiance than favour, put himself so far out of his way as to come upstairs with him and announce him. Lord Decimus, being an overpowering peer, a bashful young member of the lower house, who was the last fish but one caught by the Barnacles, and who had been invited on this occasion to commemorate his capture, shut his eyes when his lordship came in. Lord Decimus, nevertheless, was glad to see the member. He was also glad to see Mr. Merdle, glad to see Bishop, glad to see Bar, glad to see Physician, glad to see Tight Barnacle, glad to see Chorus, glad to see Ferdinand, his private secretary. Lord Decimus, though one of the greatest of the earth, was not remarkable for ingratiatory manners, and Ferdinand had coached him up to the point of noticing all the fellows he might find there, and saying he was glad to see them. When he had achieved this rush of vivacity and condescension, his lordship composed himself into the picture after Cuyp, and made a third cow in the group. Bar, who felt that he had got all the rest of the jury, and must now lay hold of the foreman, soon came sidling up, double eyeglass in hand. Bar tendered the weather, as a subject neatly aloof from official reserve, for the foreman's consideration. Bar said that he was told, as everybody always is told, though who tells them and why will ever remain a mystery, that there was to be no wall fruit this year. Lord Decimus had not heard anything amiss of his peaches, but rather believed, if his people were correct, he was to have no apples. No apples? Bar was lost in astonishment and concern. It would have been all one to him, in reality, if there had not been a pippin on the surface of the earth, but his show of interest in this apple question was positively painful. Now, to what Lord Decimus, for we troublesome lawyers love to gather information, and could never tell how useful it might prove to us, to what Lord Decimus was this to be attributed? Lord Decimus could not undertake to propound any theory about it. This might have stopped another man, but Bar, sticking to him afresh as ever, said, "As to pears now." Long after Bar got made Attorney General, this was told of him as a masterstroke. Lord Decimus had a reminiscence about a pear tree formerly growing in a garden near the back of his dame's house at Eton, upon which pear tree the only joke of his life perennially bloomed. It was a joke of a compact and portable nature, turning on the difference between Eton pears and parliamentary pears, but it was a joke, a refined relish of which would seem to have appeared to Lord Decimus impossible to be had without a thorough and intimate acquaintance with the tree. Therefore, the story at first had no idea of such a tree, sir, then gradually found it in winter, carried it through the changing season, saw it bud, saw it blossom, saw it bear fruit, saw the fruit ripen, in short, cultivated the tree in that diligent and minute manner before it got out of the bedroom window to steal the fruit, that many thanks had been offered up by belated listeners for the trees having been planted and grafted prior to Lord Decimus's time. Bar's interest in apples was so overtopped by the rapt suspense in which he pursued the changes of these pears, from the moment when Lord Decimus solemnly opened with, "Your mentioning pears recalls to my remembrance a pear tree," down to the rich conclusion, "And so we pass through the various changes of life, from Eton pears to parliamentary pears," that he had to go downstairs with Lord Decimus, and even then to be seated next to him at table in order that he might hear the anecdote out. By that time, Bar felt that he had secured the foreman, and might go to dinner with a good appetite. It was a dinner to provoke an appetite, though he had not had one. The rarest dishes, sumptuously cooked and sumptuously served, the choicest fruits, the most exquisite wines, marvels of workmanship in gold and silver, china and glass, innumerable things delicious to the senses of taste, smell, and sight, were insinuated into its composition. Oh, what a wonderful man this Merdle! What a great man! What a master man! How blessedly and enviably endowed! In one word, what a rich man! He took his usual poor 18-pennyworth of food in his usual indigestive way, and had as little to say for himself as ever a wonderful man had. Fortunately, Lord Decimus was one of those sublimities who have no occasion to be talked to, for they can be at any time sufficiently occupied with the contemplation of their own greatness. This enabled the bashful young member to keep his eyes open long enough at a time to see his dinner, but whenever Lord Decimus spoke, he shut them again. The agreeable young Barnacle and Bar were the talkers of the party. Bishop would have been exceedingly agreeable also, but that his innocence stood in his way. He was so soon left behind. When there was any little hint of anything being in the wind, he got lost directly. Worldly affairs were too much for him. He couldn't make them out at all. There was observable when Barr said, incidentally, that he was happy to have heard that we were soon to have the advantage of enlisting on the good side the sound and plain sagacity, not demonstrative or ostentatious, but thoroughly sound and practical, of our friend Mr. Sparkler. Ferdinand Barnacle laughed and said, oh yes, he believed so. A vote was a vote, and always acceptable. Barr was sorry to miss our good friend Mr. Sparkler today, Mr. Merdle. He is away with Mrs. Merdle, returned that gentleman, slowly coming out of a long abstraction, in the course of which he had been fitting a tablespoon up his sleeve. It is not indispensable for him to be on the spot. The magic name of Merdle, said Barr, with the jury droop, no doubt will suffice for all. Why, yes, I believe so, assented Mr. Merdle, putting the spoon aside and clumsily hiding each of his hands in the coat cuff of the other hand. I believe the people in my interest down there will not make any difficulty. Model people, said Barr. I'm glad you approve of them, said Mr. Merdle. And the people of those other two places now? Pursued Barr, with a bright twinkle in his keen eye, as it slightly turned in the direction of his magnificent neighbour. We lawyers are always curious, always inquisitive, always picking up odds and ends for our patchwork minds, since there is no knowing when and where they may fit into some corner. The people of those other two places now? Do they yield so laudably to the vast and cumulative influence of such enterprise and such renown? Do those little rills become absorbed so quietly and easily, and, as it were, by the influence of natural laws, so beautifully in the swoop of the majestic stream as it flows upon its wondrous way, enriching the surrounding lands, that their course is perfectly to be calculated and distinctly to be predicated? Mr. Merdle, a little troubled by Barr's eloquence, looked fitfully about the nearest salt-cellar for some moments, and then said, hesitating, They are perfectly aware, sir, of their duty to society. They will return anybody I send to them for that purpose. Cheering to know, said Barr, cheering to know. The three places in question were three little rotten holes in this island, containing three little ignorant, drunken, guzzling, dirty, out-of-the-way constituencies that had reeled into Mr. Merdle's pocket. Ferdinand Barnacle laughed in his easy way, and airily said they were a nice set of fellows. Bishop, mentally perambulating among paths of peace, was altogether swallowed up in absence of mind. Pray, asked Lord Decimus, casting his eyes around the table, what is this story I have heard of a gentleman long confined in a debtor's prison, proving to be of a wealthy family and having come into the inheritance of a large sum of money? I have met with a variety of allusions to it. Do you know anything of it, Ferdinand? I only know this much, said Ferdinand, that he has given the department with which I have the honour to be associated. This sparkling young Barnacle threw off the phrase sportively, as who should say, we know all about these forms of speech, but we must keep it up, we must keep the game alive. No end of trouble, and has put us into innumerable fixes. Fixes? Repeated Lord Decimus, with a majestic pausing and pondering on the word that made the bashful member shut his eyes quite tight. Fixes? A very perplexing business indeed, observed Mr. Tight Barnacle, with an air of grave resentment. What, said Lord Decimus, was the character of his business? What was the nature of these, fixes, Ferdinand? Oh, it's a good story, as a story, returned that gentleman, as good a thing of its kind as need be. This Mr. Dorrit, his name is Dorrit, had incurred a responsibility to us, ages before the fairy came out of the bank and gave him his fortune, under a bond he had signed for the performance of a contract which was not at all performed. He was a partner in a house in some large way, spirits or buttons or wine or blacking or oatmeal or woolen or pork or hooks and eyes or iron or treacle or shoes or something or other that was wanted for troops or seamen or somebody, and the house burst, and we were among the creditors. Detainees were lodged on the part of the Crown in a scientific manner, and all the rest of it. When the fairy had appeared and he wanted to pay us off, egad, we had got into such an exemplary state of checking and counter-checking, signing and countersigning, that it was 6 months before we knew how to take the money or how to give a receipt for it. It was a triumph of public business, said this handsome young Barnacle, laughing heartily. You never saw such a lot of forms in your life. Why, the attorney said to me one day, if I wanted this office to give me £2,000 or £3,000 instead of take it, I couldn't have more trouble about it. You are right, old fellow, I told him, and in future you'll know that we have something to do here. The pleasant young Barnacle finished by once more laughing heartily. He was a very easy, pleasant fellow indeed, and his manners were exceedingly winning. Mr. Tite Barnacle's view of the business was of a less airy character. He took it ill that Mr. Dorrit had troubled the department by wanting to pay the money, and considered it a grossly informal thing to do after so many years. But Mr. Tite Barnacle was a buttoned-up man, and consequently a weighty one. All buttoned-up men are weighty. All buttoned-up men are believed in. Whether or no the reserved and never exercised power of unbuttoning fascinates mankind, whether or no wisdom is supposed to condense and augment when buttoned up, and to evaporate when unbuttoned, it is certain that the man to whom importance is accorded is the buttoned-up man. Mr. Tite Barnacle never would have passed for half his current value unless his coat had been always buttoned up to his white cravat. "May I ask," said Lord Decimus, "if Mr. Darrit or Dorrit has any family?" Nobody else replying, the host said, "He has 2 daughters, my lord." "Oh, you are acquainted with him?" asked Lord Decimus. "Mrs. Merdle is. Mr. Sparkler is too. In fact," said Mr. Merdle, "I rather believe that one of the young ladies has made an impression on Edmund Sparkler. He is susceptible, and I think the conquest—" Here Mr. Merdle stopped and looked at the tablecloth as he usually did when he found himself observed or listened to. Bar was uncommonly pleased to find that the Merdle family and this family had already been brought into contact. He submitted in a low voice across the table to Bishop that it was a kind of analogical illustration of those physical laws in virtue of which, like flies to like, he regarded this power of attraction in wealth to draw wealth to it as something remarkably interesting and curious, something indefinably allied to the lodestone and gravitation. Bishop, who had ambled back to earth again when the present theme was broached, acquiesced. He said it was indeed highly important to society that one in the trying situation of unexpectedly finding himself invested with a power for good or for evil in society should become, as it were, merged in the superior power of a more legitimate and more gigantic growth, the influence of which, as in the case of our friend at whose board we sat, was habitually exercised in harmony with the best interests of society. Thus, instead of 2 rival and contending flames, a larger and a lesser, each burning with a lurid and uncertain glare, we had a blended and a softened light whose genial ray diffused an equable warmth throughout the land. Bishop seemed to like his own way of putting the case very much, and rather dwelt upon it, Bar, meanwhile, not to throw away a juryman, making a show of sitting at his feet and feeding on his precepts. The dinner and dessert being 3 hours long, the bashful member cooled in the shadow of Lord Decimus faster than he warmed with food and drink, and had but a chilly time of it. Lord Decimus, like a tall tower in a flat country, seemed to project himself across the tablecloth, hide the light from the honourable member, cool the honourable member's marrow, and give him a woeful idea of distance. When he asked this unfortunate traveller to take wine, he encompassed his faltering steps with the gloomiest of shades, and when he said, "Your health, sir," all around him was barrenness and desolation. At length, Lord Decimus, with a cup of coffee in his hand, began to hover about among the pictures, and to cause an interesting speculation to arise in all minds as to the probabilities of his ceasing to hover and enabling the smaller birds to flutter upstairs, which could not be done until he had urged his noble pinions in that direction. After some delay and several stretches of his wings which came to nothing, he soared to the drawing-rooms. And here a difficulty arose, which always does arise when two people are specially brought together at a dinner to confer with one another. Everybody, except Bishop, who had no suspicion of it, knew perfectly well that this dinner had been eaten and drunk specifically to the end that Lord Decimus and Mr. Merdle should have 5 minutes' conversation together. The opportunity so elaborately prepared was now arrived, and it seemed from that moment that no mere human ingenuity could so much as get the two chieftains into the same room. Mr. Merdle and his noble guest persisted in prowling about at opposite ends of the perspective. It was in vain for the engaging Ferdinand to bring Lord Decimus to look at the bronze horses near Mr. Merdle. Then Mr. Merdle evaded and wandered away. It was in vain for him to bring Mr. Merdle to Lord Decimus to tell him the history of the unique Dresden vases. Then Lord Decimus evaded and wandered away, while he was getting his man up to the mark. "Did you ever see such a thing as this?" said Ferdinand to Bar when he had been baffled 20 times. "Often," returned Bar. "Unless I butt one of them into an appointed corner and you butt the other," said Ferdinand, "it will not come off after all." "Very good," said Bar. "I'll butt Merdle if you like, but not my lord." Ferdinand laughed in the midst of his vexation. "Confound them both," said he, looking at his watch. "I want to get away. Why the deuce can't they come together? They both knew what they want and mean to do. Look at them." They were still looming at opposite ends of the perspective, each with an absurd pretence of not having the other on his mind, which could not have been more transparently ridiculous, though his real mind had been chalked on his back. Bishop, who had just now made a third with Bar and Ferdinand, but whose innocence had again cut him out of the subject and washed him in sweet oil, was seen to approach Lord Decimus and glide into conversation. "I must get Merdle's doctor to catch and secure him, I suppose," said Ferdinand, "and then I must lay hold of my illustrious kinsman and decoy him if I can, drag him if I can't, to the conference." "Since you do me the honour," said Bar, with his slyest smile, "to ask for my poor aid, it shall be yours with the greatest pleasure. I don't think this is to be done by one man, but if you will undertake to pen my lord into that furthest drawing-room where he is now so profoundly engaged, I will undertake to bring our dear Merdle into the presence without the possibility of getting away." "Done," said Ferdinand. "Done," said Bar. Bar was a sight wondrous to behold and full of matter when, jauntily waving his double eyeglass by its ribbon, and jauntily drooping to a universe of jurymen, he, in the most accidental manner ever seen, found himself at Mr. Merdle's shoulder, and embraced that opportunity of mentioning a little point to him on which he particularly wished to be guided by the light of his practical knowledge. Here he took Mr. Merdle's arm and walked him gently away. A banker whom we will call A.B. advanced a considerable sum of money, which we would call £15,000, to a client or customer of his, whom we would call P.Q. Here, as they were getting towards Lord Decimus, he held Mr. Merdle tight. As a security for the repayment of this advance to P.Q., whom we would call a widow lady, they were placed in A.B.'s hands the title deeds of a freehold estate, which we would call Blinkkiter Doodles. Now the point was this. A limited right of felling and lopping in the woods of Blinkkiter Doodles lay in the son of P.Q., then past his majority, and whom we would call X.Y., but really this was too bad. In the presence of Lord Decimus, to detain the host with chopping out dry chaff of law was really too bad. Another time. Bar was truly repentant, and would not say another syllable. Would Bishop favour him with 6 words? He had now set Mr. Merdle down on a couch, side by side with Lord Decimus, and to it they must go, now or never. And now the rest of the company, highly excited and interested, always excepting Bishop, who had not the slightest idea that anything was going on, formed in one group round the fire in the next drawing-room, and pretended to be chatting easily on the infinite variety of small topics, while everybody's thoughts and eyes were secretly straying towards the secluded pair. The chorus were excessively nervous, perhaps as labouring under the dreadful apprehension that some good thing was going to be diverted from them. Bishop alone talked steadily and evenly. He conversed with the great physician on that relaxation of the throat with which young curates were too frequently afflicted, and on the means of lessening the great prevalence of that disorder in the church. Physician, as a general rule, was of opinion that the best way to avoid it was to know how to read before you made a profession of reading. Bishop said dubiously, did he really think so? And physician said, decidedly, yes, he did. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was the only one of the party who skirmished on the outside of the circle. He kept about midway between it and the two, as if some sort of surgical operation were being performed by Lord Decimus on Mr. Merdle, or by Mr. Merdle on Lord Decimus, and his services might at any moment be required as dresser. In fact, within a quarter of an hour Lord Decimus called to him, Ferdinand, and he went and took his place in the conference for some 5 minutes more. Then a half-suppressed gasp broke out among the chorus, for Lord Decimus rose to take his leave. Again coached up by Ferdinand to the point of making himself popular, he shook hands in the most brilliant manner with the whole company, and even said to Bar, I hope you're not bored by my pears, to which Bar retorted, Eton, my lord, or parliamentary, neatly showing that he had mastered the joke and delicately insinuating that he could never forget it while his life remained. All the grave importance that was buttoned up in Mr. Tite Barnacle took itself away next, and Ferdinand took himself away next to the opera. Some of the rest lingered a little, marrying golden liqueur glasses to buhl tables with sticky rings, on the desperate chance of Mr. Merdle saying something. But Merdle, as usual, oozed sluggishly and muddily about his drawing-room, saying never a word. In a day or two it was announced to all the town that Edmund Sparkler, Esquire, son-in-law of the eminent Mr. Merdle of world-wide renown, was made one of the Lords of the Circumlocution Office, and proclamation was issued to all true believers that this admirable appointment was to be hailed as a graceful and gracious mark of homage rendered by the graceful and gracious Decimus to that commercial interest which must ever in a great commercial country, and all the rest of it, with a blast of trumpet. So, bolstered by this mark of government homage, the wonderful bank and all the other wonderful undertakings went on and went up, and gapers came to Harley Street, Cavendish Square, only to look at the house where the golden wonder lived. And when they saw the chief butler looking out at the hall door in his moments of condescension, the gapers said how rich he looked, and wondered how much money he had in the wonderful bank. But if they had known that respectable nemesis better, they would not have wondered about it, and might have stated the amount with the utmost precision. Chapter 13. The Progress of an Epidemic. That it is at least as difficult to stay a moral infection as a physical one, that such a disease will spread with the malignity and rapidity of the plague, that the contagion, when it has once made head, will spare no pursuit or condition, but will lay hold on people in the soundest health and become developed in the most unlikely constitutions, is a fact as firmly established by experience as that we human creatures breathe an atmosphere. A blessing beyond appreciation would be conferred upon mankind if the tainted in whose weakness or wickedness these virulent disorders are bred could be instantly seized and placed in close confinement, not to say summarily smothered, before the poison is communicable. As a vast fire will fill the air to a great distance with its roar, so the sacred flame which the mighty Barnacles had fanned caused the air to resound more and more with the name of Merdle. It was deposited on every lip and carried into every ear. There never was, there never had been, there never again should be such a man as Mr. Merdle. Nobody, as aforesaid, knew what he had done, but everybody knew him to be the greatest that had appeared. Down in Bleeding Heart Yard, where there was not one unappropriated halfpenny, as lively an interest was taken in this paragon of men as on the Stock Exchange. Mrs. Plornish, now established in the small grocery and general trade, in a snug little shop at the crack end of the yard, at the top of the steps, with her little old father and Maggie acting as assistants, habitually held forth about him over the counter in conversation with her customers. Mr. Plornish, who had a small share in a small builder's business in the neighbourhood, said, trowel in hand, on the tops of scaffolds on the tiles of houses, that people did tell him as Mr. Merdle was the one, mind you, to put us all to rights in respects of that which all on us looked to, and to bring us all safe home as much as we needed, mind you, fur to be brought. Mr. Baptiste, sole lodger of Mr. and Mrs. Plornish, was reputed in whispers to lay by the savings which were the result of his simple and moderate life for investment in one of Mr. Merdle's certain enterprises. The female Bleeding Hearts, when they came for ounces of tea and hundredweights of talk, gave Mrs. Plornish to understand that how, ma'am, they had heard from their cousin Mary Ann, which worked in the line, that his lady's dresses would fill 3 wagons. That how she was as handsome a lady, ma'am, as lived no matter wheres, and a busk like marble itself. That how, according to what they was told, ma'am, it was a son by a former husband as was took into the government, and a general he had been, and armies he had marched again, and victory crowned, if all you heard was to be believed. That how it was reported that Mr. Merdle's words had been that if they could have made it worth his while to take the whole government, he would have took it without a profit, but that take it he could not, and stand a loss. That how it was not to be expected, ma'am, that he should lose by it, his ways being, as you might say, and utter no falsehood, paved with gold. But that how it was much to be regretted that something handsome hadn't been got up to make it worth his while, for it was such and only such that knowed the heighteth to which the bread and butcher's meat had rose, and it was such and only such that both could and would bring that heighteth down. So rife and potent was the fever in Bleeding Heart Yard that Mr. Pank's rent days caused no interval in the patients. The disease took the singular form on those occasions of causing the infected to find an unfathomable excuse and consolation in allusions to the magic name. Now then, Mr. Panks would say to a defaulting lodger, pay up. Come on. I haven't got it, Mr. Panks, defaulter would reply. I tell you the truth, sir, when I say I haven't got so much as a single sixpence of it to bless myself with. This won't do, you know, Mr. Panks would retort. You don't expect it will do you? A defaulter would admit with a low-spirited, no, sir, having no such expectation. My proprietor isn't going to stand this, you know, Mr. Panks would proceed. He don't send me here for this. Pay up, come. The defaulter would make answer, Oh, Mr. Panks, if I was the rich gentleman whose name is in everybody's mouth, if my name was Merdle, sir, I'd soon pay up and be glad to do it. Dialogues on the rent question usually took place at the house doors or in the entries, and in the presence of several deeply interested Bleeding Hearts. They always received a reference of this kind with a low murmur of response, as if it were convincing, and the defaulter, however black and discomfited before, always cheered up a little in making it. If I was Mr. Merdle, sir, you wouldn't have cause to complain of me then? No, believe me, the defaulter would proceed with a shake of the head. I'd pay up so quick then, Mr. Panks, that you shouldn't have to ask me. The response would be heard again here, implying that it was impossible to say anything fairer, and that this was the next thing to paying the money down. Mr. Panks would be now reduced to saying as he booked the case, Well, you'll have the broker in and be turned out. That's what'll happen to you. It's no use talking to me about Mr. Merdle. You are not Mr. Merdle any more than I am. No, sir, the defaulter would reply. I only wish you were him, sir. The response would take this up quickly, replying with great feeling, Only wish you were him, sir. You'd be easier with us if you were Mr. Merdle, sir, the defaulter would go on with rising spirits, and it would be better for all parties, better for our sakes and better for yours too. You wouldn't have to worry no one then, sir. You wouldn't have to worry us, and you wouldn't have to worry yourself. You'd be easier in your own mind, sir, and you'd leave others easier too, you would, if you were Mr. Merdle." Mr. Panks, in whom these impersonal compliments produced an irresistible sheepishness, never rallied after such a charge. He could only bite his nails and puff away to the next defaulter. The responsive bleeding hearts would then gather round the defaulter whom he had just abandoned, and the most extravagant rumours would circulate among them, to their great comfort, touching the amount of Mr. Merdle's ready money. From one of the many such defeats of one of many rent days, Mr. Panks, having finished his day's collection, repaired with his notebook under his arm to Mrs. Plawnish's corner. Mr. Panks' object was not professional, but social. He had had a trying day and wanted a little brightening. By this time he was on friendly terms with the Plawnish family, having often looked in upon them at similar seasons and borne his part in recollections of Miss Dorrit. Mrs. Plawnish's shop-parlour had been decorated under her own eye, and presented, on the side towards the shop, a little fiction in which Mrs. Plawnish unspeakably rejoiced. This poetical heightening of the parlour consisted in the wall being painted to represent the exterior of a thatched cottage, the artist having introduced, in as effective a manner as he found compatible with their highly disproportionate dimensions, the real door and window. The modest sunflower and hollyhock were depicted as flourishing with great luxuriance on this rustic dwelling, while a quantity of dense smoke issuing from the chimney indicated good cheer within, and also, perhaps, that it had not been lately swept. A faithful dog was represented as flying at the legs of the friendly visitor from the threshold, and a circular pigeon-house enveloped in a cloud of pigeons arose from behind the garden paling. On the door, when it was shut, appeared the semblance of a brass plate, presenting the inscription, "Happy Cottage, T. and M. Plawnish," the partnership expressing man and wife. No poetry and no art ever charmed the imagination more than the union of the two in this counterfeit cottage charmed Mrs. Plawnish. It was nothing to her that Plawnish had a habit of leaning against it as he smoked his pipe after work, when his hat blotted out the pigeon-house and all the pigeons, when his back swallowed up the dwelling, when his hands in his pockets uprooted the blooming garden and laid waste the adjacent country. To Mrs. Plawnish it was still a most beautiful cottage, a most wonderful deception, and it made no difference that Mr. Plawnish's eye was some inches above the level of the gable bedroom in the thatch. To come out into the shop after it was shut, and hear her father sing a song inside this cottage, was a perfect pastoral to Mrs. Plawnish, the golden age revived. And truly, if that famous period had been revived, or had ever been at all, it may be doubted whether it would have produced many more heartily admiring daughters than the poor woman. Warned of a visitor by the tinkling bell at the shop door, Mrs. Plawnish came out of Happy Cottage to see who it might be. "I guessed it was you, Mr. Panks," said she, "for it's quite your regular night, ain't it? Here's father, you see, come out to serve at the sound of the bell like a brisk young shopman. Ain't he looking well? Father's more pleased to see you than if you were a customer, for he dearly loves a gossip, and when it turns upon Miss Dorrit, he loves it all the more. You never heard father in such voice as he is at present," said Mrs. Plawnish, her own voice quavering. She was so proud and pleased. "He gave us Strephon last night to that degree that Plawnish gets up and makes him this speech across the table. 'John Edward Nandy,' says Plawnish to father, 'I never heard you come the warbles as I've heard you come the warbles this night.' Ain't it gratifying, Mr. Panks, though, really?" Mr. Panks, who had snorted at the old man in his friendliest manner, replied in the affirmative, and casually asked whether that lively outro chap had come in yet. Mrs. Plawnish answered no, not yet, though he had gone to the West End with some work, and had said he should be back by tea-time. Mr. Panks was then hospitably pressed into Happy Cottage, where he encountered the elder Master Plawnish, just come home from school. Examining that young student lightly on the educational proceedings of the day, he found that the more advanced pupils, who were in the large text and the letter M, had been set the copy Merdle Millions. "And how are you getting on, Mrs. Plawnish?" said Panks, "since we're mentioning millions?" Very steady indeed, sir, returned Mrs. Plornish. Father dear, would you go into the shop and tidy a window a little bit before tea, your taste being so beautiful? John Edward Nandy trotted away, much gratified, to comply with his daughter's request. Mrs. Plornish, who was always in mortal terror of mentioning pecuniary affairs before the old gentleman, lest any disclosure she might make rouse his spirit and induce him to run away to the workhouse, was thus left free to be confidential with Mr. Panks. "It's quite true that the business is very steady indeed," said Mrs. Plornish, lowering her voice, "and has excellent connection. The only thing that stands in its way, sir, is the credit." This drawback, rather severely felt by most people who engaged in commercial transactions, and the inhabitants of Bleeding Heart Yard, was a large stumbling block in Mrs. Plornish's trade. When Mr. Dorrit had established her in the business, the Bleeding Hearts had shown an amount of emotion and a determination to support her in it that did honour to human nature. Recognizing her claim upon their generous feelings as one who had long been a member of their community, they pledged themselves with great feeling to deal with Mrs. Plornish, come what would, and bestow their patronage on no other establishment. Influenced by these noble sentiments, they had even gone out of their way to purchase little luxuries in the grocery and butter line to which they were unaccustomed, saying to one another that if they did stretch a point, was it not for a neighbour and a friend, and for whom ought to a point be stretched, if not for such? So stimulated, the business was extremely brisk, and the articles in stock went off with the greatest celerity. In short, if the Bleeding Hearts had but paid, the undertaking would have been a complete success, whereas, by reason of their exclusively confining themselves to owing, the profits actually realized had not yet begun to appear in the books. Mr. Panks was making a very porcupine of himself by sticking his hair up in the contemplation of this state of accounts, when old Mr. Nandy, re-entering the cottage with an air of mystery, entreated them to come and look at the strange behaviour of Mr. Baptiste, who seemed to have met with something that had scared him. All three, going to the shop and watching through the window, then saw Mr. Baptiste, pale and agitated, go through the following extraordinary performances. First, he was observed hiding at the top of the steps leading down into the yard, and peeping up and down the street with his head cautiously thrust out close to the side of the shop door. After very anxious scrutiny, he came out of his retreat and went briskly down the street as if he were going away altogether, then suddenly turned about and went at the same pace and with the same feint up the street. He had gone no further up the street than he had gone down when he crossed the road and disappeared. The object of this last manoeuvre was only apparent when his entering the shop with a sudden twist from the steps again explained that he had made a wide and obscure circuit round to the other or Doyce and Clenham end of the yard, and had come through the yard and bolted in. He was out of breath by that time, as he might well be, and his heart seemed to jerk faster than the little shop bell as it quivered and jingled behind him with his hasty shutting of the door. "Hello, old chap," said Mr. Panks. "Outro, old boy, what's the matter?" Mr. Baptiste, or Signor Cavaletto, understood English now almost as well as Mr. Panks himself, and could speak it very well too. Nevertheless, Mrs. Plornish, with a pardonable vanity in that accomplishment of hers which made her all but Italian, stepped in as interpreter. "He ask no," said Mrs. Plornish. "What go wrong?" "Come into the little cottage, padrona," returned Mr. Baptiste, imparting great stealthiness to his flurried back-handed shake of his right forefinger. "Come there." Mrs. Plornish was proud of the title padrona, which she regarded as signifying not so much mistress of the house as mistress of the Italian tongue. She immediately complied with Mr. Baptiste's request, and they all went into the cottage. "I hope you no fright," said Mrs. Plornish then, interpreting Mr. Panks in a new way with her usual fertility of resource. "What happened? Pica padrona." "I have seen a someone," returned Baptiste. "I have rincontrato him." "Him? Who him?" asked Mrs. Plornish. "A bad man, a baddest man. I have hoped I should never see him again." "How you know him bad?" asked Mrs. Plornish. "It does not matter, Padrona. I know it too well." "He see you?" asked Mrs. Plornish. "No, I hope not. I believe not." "He says," Mrs. Plornish then interpreted, addressing her father and Panks with mild condescension, "that he has met a bad man, but he hopes that the bad man didn't see him." "Why?" inquired Mrs. Plornish, reverting to the Italian language. "Why hope bad man no see?" "Padrona, dearest," returned the little foreigner, whom she so considerately protected, "do not ask, I pray. Once again I say it matters not. I fear of this man. I do not wish to see him. I do not wish to be known of him. Never again. Enough. Most beautiful. Leave it." The topic was so disagreeable to him, and so put his usual liveliness to the rout, that Mrs. Plornish forbore to press him further, the rather as tea had been drawing for some time on the hob. But she was not the less surprised and curious for asking no more questions. Neither was Mr. Panks, whose expressive breathing had been labouring hard since the entrance of the little man, like a locomotive engine with a great load, getting up a steep incline. Maggie, now better dressed than of yore, though still faithful to the monstrous character of her cap,